At 8:12 a.m. on a Monday, my former CEO called and asked whether I could help save the company. 6 months after HR told me they were going a different direction, that direction had led to $9.4 million in unpaid vendor invoices and bankruptcy court. They thought cutting me would make the company leaner. They thought vendor relationships were just emails, purchase orders, and payment terms. But when the vendors stopped shipping, the clients started leaving, and the bank called in its credit line, they learned exactly what I had been warning them about. Every story here is about someone who got underestimated and made them regret it. My name is Camille Harper, and for 11 years, I worked for a company called Briarstone Commercial Interiors. We designed and furnished corporate spaces, office headquarters, hotels, medical offices, university buildings, restaurants, the polished places people walk into and assume came together easily. They see the finished lobby, the glass walls, the custom lighting, the conference tables, the reception desk with the company logo carved into it. What they do not see is the chain of people required to make that room exist. The manufacturer who builds the furniture, the freight company that moves it, the installer who carries it through a service elevator at 5:30 in the morning, the fabric supplier who ships the right material before the production deadline, the project manager who knows that one delayed shipment can stop an entire floor from opening, and the vendor relations director who makes sure every one of those people still answers the phone when something goes wrong. That was me. My title was Director of Vendor Partnerships. It sounded like a networking role. It was not. I managed relationships with 143 suppliers, manufacturers, freight carriers, installation crews, and specialty contractors. I negotiated payment terms. I monitored delivery risks. I resolved disputes. I worked with finance when invoices did not match purchase orders. I worked with project managers when clients changed their minds 2 weeks before installation. I worked with sales when they promised a delivery date that depended on 3 vendors in 2 countries and a port that was already behind schedule. Most important, I knew the difference between a vendor who is frustrated and a vendor who is preparing to walk away. That difference does not appear in a spreadsheet. It appears in the way someone answers an email. It appears in the wording of a payment reminder. It appears when a supplier who normally calls you directly starts copying their legal department. I knew those signs because I had spent 11 years earning trust. Briarstone had grown from a small regional design company into a national commercial interiors firm. When I joined, we brought in about $18 million a year. By the time I left, annual revenue had reached nearly $96 million. But growth came with a problem. Briarstone sold big projects with long timelines. A client might approve a $2 million headquarters renovation in January. We would order materials in February. Manufacturing might begin in March. Shipping might happen in May. Installation might not happen until June. But clients did not always pay on schedule. And when clients delayed payment, Briarstone still had obligations to vendors. That meant cash flow mattered. A lot. If vendors trusted us, they extended terms. 45 days. 60 days. Sometimes 90. If they did not trust us, they demanded payment before shipment. And if they demanded payment before shipment, Briarstone could not complete projects without cash it often did not have. That was why my role mattered. I did not just negotiate discounts. I protected the company's ability to operate. One of our largest projects was called the Meridian Campus build-out. Meridian was a healthcare network opening a new administrative headquarters outside Dallas. The project value was $14.6 million. Briarstone had won the contract because we promised to deliver a full, furnished, ready-to-use campus by September 15th. The client had a board meeting scheduled for September 18th. Their executives wanted to walk through the finished building before that meeting. There was no room for delay. The Meridian project involved 27 separate vendors. Custom furniture from North Carolina. Acoustic panels from Canada. Lighting systems from California. Medical-grade seating from Wisconsin. Freight coordination through Texas. Installation crews working overnight. If even one critical vendor stopped shipping, the entire schedule could unravel. I was the person who kept those vendors aligned. Not by begging. Not by making promises I could not keep. By telling them the truth early and making sure Briarstone honored the commitments I made. Then our board hired a new chief financial officer named Trevor Hale. Trevor came from private equity. He had spent most of his career buying companies, cutting costs, consolidating departments, and improving financial statements before the next transaction. He was smart. That was never the problem. The problem was that he believed every business relationship could be reduced to a number if he looked at it long enough. Trevor had a habit of turning his phone face down on the conference table whenever someone spoke. It was his way of showing that he was fully present. But he never looked at the person talking. He looked at the spreadsheet in front of him. Then he would say, "Show me the financial impact." That was his favorite phrase. "Show me the financial impact." A project manager would explain that a supplier had stopped taking calls. "Show me the financial impact." A warehouse supervisor would say a freight carrier was threatening to suspend service. "Show me the financial impact." I would explain that a vendor had extended payment terms 3 times because of my relationship with their owner. "Show me the financial impact." The financial impact was simple. The vendor kept shipping. But Trevor did not understand that some of the most important financial outcomes happen because a problem never becomes visible. He saw my salary. He saw travel expenses. He saw vendor dinners, trade show meetings, and contract review time. He saw a department that looked expensive. What he did not see was the credit flexibility behind it, the goodwill behind it, the trust behind it. Then Briarstone lost 2 medium-sized contracts in the same quarter. Nothing fatal, but enough to make the board nervous. Trevor proposed an efficiency realignment. He said vendor management should move under accounts payable. He said vendor relationships should be standardized through a shared email inbox. He said individual relationship management created inconsistent dependency. I asked how accounts payable would distinguish between a vendor who needed a payment update and a vendor who was about to halt a $700,000 shipment. Trevor looked at me. Then he said, "Camille, vendors care about one thing. They care about getting paid." I said, "They care about whether they can trust us." He gave me a thin smile. "Trust follows payment." That sentence told me exactly how little he understood. Sometimes, yes, vendors need payment. But when a company is under pressure, trust determines whether they wait, whether they ship, whether they help solve a problem, or whether they protect themselves first. Trevor did not believe that. And by the time he learned it, the company could no longer afford the lesson. My termination meeting happened at 4:59 p.m. on a Thursday. HR was there. Trevor was there. The CEO joined by video. They told me Briarstone was going a different direction. They said my role would be eliminated. They said vendor relationships would be transitioned to a more scalable, centralized financial model. I asked who would own the Meridian vendor schedule. Trevor said the accounts payable team would manage all supplier communications. I asked who would handle the 3 manufacturers that had extended our terms only because of personal agreements I had negotiated. He said, "The agreements are in the files." I said, "The terms are in the files. The reasons they agreed are not." Then he turned his phone face down on the table. He looked at me like I was making the moment harder than it had to be. And he said, "Camille, we need to stop running the business on personal relationships." I stayed calm. I said, "Then I hope the business is ready to run without them." Before I left, I sent one final email to Trevor, HR, the CEO, and the board liaison. It listed 7 vendors whose payment flexibility depended on active relationship management, not just contract language. One of those vendors controlled the custom workstations for the $14.6 million Meridian project. Trevor opened the email. He never replied. My severance agreement was fair. 8 weeks of pay. Health coverage through the end of the quarter. A standard confidentiality clause. A non-solicitation provision. Nothing unusual. And I followed every part of it. I did not call Briarstone clients. I did not contact vendors to stir up problems. I did not post anything online. I did not tell anyone to stop working with the company. I had built those relationships professionally, and I intended to leave professionally. But I also did not work for free. That mattered. The week after I left, one of my former project managers called me. Her name was Alicia. She had worked on the Meridian project for almost 2 years. She sounded tired. She said she was not calling for confidential advice. She just wanted to see how I was doing. I told her I was fine. I had already begun interviewing with 2 national firms. One was a healthcare design company. The other was a construction management group looking for someone to build a vendor risk program. Then Alicia told me what was happening at Briarstone. Trevor had centralized all vendor communication through the accounts payable portal. No more direct contact unless the invoice had already been approved. No more calls from project teams to suppliers. No exceptions without finance approval. On paper, it looked controlled. In reality, it was chaos. A vendor with a delayed invoice could not reach the project manager who understood the job. The project manager could not speak to the vendor without approval. Accounts payable could see the invoice amount, but not the delivery sequence. And Trevor had instructed his team to prioritize the largest financial exposures. That meant invoices were ranked by dollar amount, not by project risk, not by installation schedule, not by whether a delayed shipment would trigger penalties. The first visible mistake happened 10 days after I left. A company called Dalton Woodworks had completed custom reception desks for a hotel project in Atlanta. Their invoice was $86,000. Not the largest invoice in Briarstone's system. Not even close. So it sat in the portal. But the reception desks were the final missing component of a hotel opening scheduled for the following Monday. The client had a media event planned. Rooms were booked. Staff had been hired. And the hotel could not open its lobby without the desks. Dalton had always been reasonable with Briarstone. I knew the owner personally. He had extended terms on multiple projects because he knew I would call him before a problem became a surprise. But nobody called him. The invoice became 17 days overdue, then 22, then 29. At 8:07 a.m. on a Wednesday, Dalton sent a message to the shared inbox. Shipment will remain on hold pending resolution of overdue balance. Accounts payable responded at 3:42 p.m. They asked him to upload a revised invoice. It was technically correct. It was also useless. The hotel opening was delayed by 3 days. Briarstone paid expedited freight, paid overtime for installers, paid a penalty to the client, and lost money on a project that had been profitable the week before. Trevor called it a temporary workflow issue. But Alicia told me something else. The Dalton owner had said one sentence during a call with finance. If Camille had called, we would have worked something out. That was the first crack. The company had not lost a vendor yet. But a vendor had said, clearly and directly, that the new system did not have the trust the old one did. Trevor's answer was to tighten the process further. He told accounts payable that no employee could make vendor payment commitments without written finance approval. He told project managers they were not authorized to negotiate around company policy. He told sales to stop promising delivery dates before procurement confirmed vendor availability. That last part was sensible, but he delivered it like punishment. He did not fix the gap between finance and operations. He just added more gates. Within a month, suppliers began noticing. Invoices were delayed. Messages went unanswered. Payment dates changed without explanation. A manufacturer called Alpine Systems asked for a status update on $412,000 in open invoices. They supplied modular walls for 3 major projects, including Meridian. The accounts payable team replied that payment would be issued according to standard processing timelines. That sentence might sound harmless. But Alpine did not have standard terms with Briarstone. They had custom terms. Terms I had negotiated after Briarstone's CEO personally asked them to prioritize the Meridian project. They had agreed to ship in stages before full payment because I had shown them the client funding schedule and guaranteed weekly updates. The arrangement was not in a standard portal note. It was in the relationship. When Alpine did not get the update they expected, their controller called Briarstone. He asked for me. The receptionist told him I no longer worked there. He asked to speak to Trevor. Trevor did not take the call. That was his second visible mistake. He believed that refusing to engage would strengthen his negotiating position. Instead, it told Alpine something much more dangerous. It told them Briarstone no longer had anyone accountable. 3 days later, Alpine moved Briarstone from net 60 terms to payment before shipment. The decision affected $1.8 million in materials scheduled for Meridian. Suddenly, Briarstone needed cash it had not planned to spend for another 2 months. Trevor sent a message to the CEO. He called it an isolated vendor policy adjustment. But the CEO asked one question. Can we still meet the Meridian delivery date? Trevor said yes. He had not checked. He was guessing. And, because no one wanted to challenge the CFO, the guess became the official plan. That was when the stakes started rising. Briarstone began paying whichever vendors were loudest, not whichever vendors were most important. A freight company in Houston received an overdue payment because they threatened to suspend service. A small lighting supplier received a partial payment because they copied the client's project manager. But the manufacturer building Meridian's custom workstations received nothing. Their invoice was not due yet. That was Trevor's defense. Technically, he was right. But the workstation manufacturer had already seen the Alpine problem. They knew Briarstone's payment behavior was changing. And they knew the project depended on them. So they started asking questions. Could Briarstone guarantee the remaining production payments? Would installation crews be ready on time? Was the client funding secure? Those are not casual questions. Those are the questions vendors ask when they are deciding whether to protect their own business before yours. The first satisfying turn came when Briarstone's CEO received a direct email from the workstation manufacturer's president. The email was short. It said the company was reviewing all outstanding exposure with Briarstone and would require executive confirmation before releasing the Meridian shipment. The CEO forwarded it to Trevor. Then he asked, "Why is our biggest project supplier emailing me directly?" Trevor said the vendor was being difficult. The CEO replied, "Or they do not trust us." That was the first time someone at the top said the word Trevor had been avoiding. Trust. If you have ever watched a company treat relationships like an expense until the invoices, delays, and losses arrive, subscribe, because this was the moment the spreadsheet finally started telling the truth. Trevor did not apologize. He did not ask what I had warned them about. Instead, he blamed the old process. He told the CEO that vendors had become too accustomed to informal accommodations. He said Briarstone needed to stop rewarding suppliers who used urgency to pressure the company. He said the centralized model would work once everyone adjusted. Then he proposed something even worse. He stretched vendor payments across the company. He believed that holding cash for an extra 2 weeks would give Briarstone room to stabilize its financial position. He did not tell vendors clearly. He did not call them. He did not create a recovery plan. He simply changed payment schedules. The company saved cash for 14 days. Then it began losing the ability to buy the materials it needed. By the end of the second month, 6 vendors had moved Briarstone to restricted terms. 2 freight carriers required payment before pickup. 1 installation crew refused to schedule new work until its outstanding balance was cleared. And the workstation manufacturer placed Meridian's production order on hold. Not canceled. On hold. That was worse. A cancellation gives you a problem. A hold gives you a clock. Every day the order sat waiting, the September deadline moved closer. The Meridian client began asking for updates. Alicia told them Briarstone was coordinating supply chain timing. That was the approved language from Trevor. But the client had their own construction team. They could see the unfinished floors. They could see the missing furniture. They could see that installation crews had not arrived. By the time Briarstone admitted there was a vendor delay, Meridian had already started calling competitors. Then, at 6:18 p.m. on a Friday, I got an email from Briarstone's general counsel. They wanted to discuss limited transition assistance. No apology. No explanation. Just a request for a call. I did not answer immediately. I forwarded the email to my attorney. Then I read my old warning message again. 7 vendors. 7 risks. One of them was the Meridian workstation manufacturer. The vendor Briarstone now needed more than anyone. At 8:02 p.m., Trevor called me. He sounded frustrated. Not scared yet. "Camille, we need background on a few vendor relationships." I said, "Those relationships are Briarstone's business. My documentation was included in the transition materials. We need context. You had the context before you eliminated my role. This is not about that." "No," I said. It is about a supplier deciding whether they can trust your company." He went quiet. Then he said, "Can you call the workstation manufacturer?" I asked, as what? As someone they know. That is not a job description. Camille, we are trying to protect a major project. So was I. He did not like that answer. But he could not argue with it. I said, if Briarstone wants me to provide consulting support, legal can send a written engagement proposal. I will not make informal calls on behalf of a company that ended my employment. He hung up. The next morning, the workstation manufacturer formally suspended production. And that was when Briarstone finally understood they did not just need my old files. They needed the credibility I had spent 11 years building. The Monday after production was suspended, Briarstone's CEO called me at 8:12 a.m. His name was Stephen Calder. He had founded the company 26 years earlier. I had always respected Stephen. He was not perfect. But he had built Briarstone from a small office with 3 employees into a company that employed more than 400 people. He had trusted Trevor because Trevor spoke the language the board wanted to hear. Margins. Efficiency. Cash preservation. Centralization. Now, Stephen sounded tired. He said, "Camille, I owe you an apology." I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "What happened?" He answered honestly. Trevor thought he could manage the vendors through finance. I let him try it. I ignored your warning. That mattered. Not because it fixed anything, but because he said it plainly. I asked what he needed. He told me the workstation manufacturer had suspended Meridian production. Alpine Systems had not released the modular walls. 2 freight carriers had restricted credit. And Meridian had issued a notice demanding a recovery plan within 48 hours. The client had also paused a scheduled $2.1 million progress payment. That was the part that made the situation dangerous. Briarstone needed money to pay vendors. But the client was holding money because the vendors were not shipping. It was a trap. And every hour made it tighter. Stephen asked if I would help. I said, I can consider an independent consulting engagement. But I need a defined scope, direct authority for vendor recovery, and full access to payment status information. He agreed immediately. Trevor did not. At 9:04 a.m., he joined the legal call and objected to my terms. My rate was $450 per hour. There was a 40-hour minimum paid in advance. My scope included vendor stabilization, Meridian recovery planning, and a review of Briarstone's supplier risk process. I would report to Stephen directly, and no one could make a vendor commitment under my name without my written approval. Trevor said, "This is opportunistic." I said, "No, it is professional. You ended a role that protected these relationships. Now you are asking me to restore them in the middle of a financial crisis." He said, "We do not have time for this." I said, "Then you should have read the email I sent before you fired me." Stephen did not defend Trevor. At 9:27 a.m., he approved the agreement. At 10 a.m., I began reviewing the vendor ledger. The numbers were worse than I expected. Not because the company owed money. Businesses owe vendors money all the time. The problem was the pattern. $9.4 million in unpaid vendor invoices. More than $3 million overdue. 18 vendors with restricted terms. For critical suppliers threatening to halt delivery. And the Meridian project sitting at the center of all of it. Trevor had been managing cash by delaying payments without explaining the strategy. He thought vendors would wait because they had waited before. But they had waited before because I had called them. I had told them what was happening. I had given them dates. I had kept promises. When an unavoidable delay happened, I made sure it happened once, not 3 times. Trevor had removed the relationship and kept the delay. That was the difference. My first call was to the workstation manufacturer. The owner answered on the second ring. His name was not important. What mattered was that he recognized my voice. "Camille," he said. "I heard you left Briarstone." I did. "Then why are you calling?" "Because I am consulting for the recovery of the Meridian project." He was quiet. Then he said, "Are they paying us?" I did not lie. I said, "I am reviewing the payment plan now. I will not make promises I cannot keep. But I can give you a clear answer by noon." He said, "We have heard clear answers before." "I know," I said. That is why I am not asking you to trust a slogan. I am asking you to judge me by whether I call you back at noon. At 11:56 a.m., I called him back. Not at 12:10. Not at 12:30. At 11:56. I explained that Briarstone could make an immediate payment of $480,000. The remaining balance would be secured through a written schedule approved by Stephen personally. In exchange, the manufacturer would restart production that afternoon and release the first completed units on an expedited schedule. The owner said he needed proof. I sent it within 5 minutes. At 12:32 p.m., production restarted. That was one vendor. One problem. But it created a path. Next, I called Alpine Systems. They were angrier. Their controller had been ignored by finance twice. Their sales director had been told someone would circle back. They had already begun offering their production capacity to another customer. I did not blame them. I told them Briarstone had failed to communicate. I told them exactly what payment could be made and when. Then I asked what it would take to release the Meridian materials without putting their business at risk. They wanted a partial payment, a letter of credit, and a direct executive commitment that their future invoices would not be handled through the shared portal. Stephen signed the letter himself. Alpine released the materials. For 48 hours, I barely slept. I spoke to freight carriers, installers, lighting suppliers, fabricators, vendors who had every reason to say no. Some did say no. One supplier had already sold our reserved inventory to someone else. Another would not move without full payment. But enough agreed to work with us that Meridian's project did not collapse immediately. Then the real problem surfaced. The bank had reviewed Briarstone's vendor exposure. It saw the delayed payments, the restricted credit, the paused client funds, and the rising risk around Meridian. The bank informed Stephen that Briarstone had violated a covenant on its revolving credit line. The company had 10 business days to cure the issue, or the bank could demand immediate action. Trevor had known about the covenant risk. I discovered an email in the finance records sent 2 weeks earlier. It warned that vendor credit restrictions could affect borrowing availability. Trevor had marked it for review, then done nothing. At that point, the company did not have an operations problem. It had a survival problem. Meridian gave Briarstone one final choice: deliver a credible recovery plan with verified vendor commitments and a revised schedule, or lose the project. If Briarstone lost Meridian, it would not just lose $14.6 million in revenue. It would lose the progress payments needed to stabilize cash flow. And if it lost that cash flow, the bank's decision would be simple. At 7:40 p.m. on the 9th business day, Stephen held an emergency board meeting. Trevor was there. The bank's restructuring advisor was there. Legal counsel was there. And I was there as a consultant, with a vendor status report in front of me. The report was clear. 19 critical vendors. 12 stabilized. For partially stabilized, 3 lost. Meridian could still be completed, but only with an emergency financing package and a revised schedule that included penalties. Then one board member asked Trevor a question. Why were we not told these relationships were this fragile? Trevor said they should not have been fragile. The company had become too dependent on informal arrangements. I looked at him. Then I said they were not informal arrangements. They were commercial relationships supported by documented terms, ongoing communication, and trust built over time. The fragility came from removing the communication and keeping the obligations. The room went silent. Stephen asked whether I had warned them. I opened the email. Sent at 6:11 p.m. on my final day. 7 vendor names. 7 risks. A clear recommendation to assign senior relationship ownership before changing payment procedures. And the Meridian manufacturer listed first. Stephen read it. Then he looked at Trevor. Trevor had nothing to say. The board voted that night to remove him as CFO. But it was too late to reverse the damage completely. Briarstone secured short-term emergency financing. It completed Meridian 6 weeks late. It paid penalties. It sold part of its warehouse operation. It laid off employees who had done nothing wrong. And 3 months later, when the bank refused to renew the credit line, Briarstone filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. HR had said they were going a different direction. They were right. The direction was bankruptcy. Stephen called me one final time after the filing. He asked if I would stay on to help the restructuring team preserve the vendor network. I agreed for a limited period. Not because I wanted revenge. Because hundreds of employees, installers, project managers, and small suppliers were caught in the consequences of decisions they did not make. I helped protect what could be protected. But the company I had known was gone. Trevor had wanted to show me the financial impact. In the end, he got it. $9.4 million in unpaid invoices. A $14.6 million project nearly lost. A credit line called into question. Hundreds of jobs placed at risk. And a company pushed into bankruptcy because someone believed trust was too expensive to maintain. The lesson is not that every company should depend on one employee. It should not. The lesson is that relationships, operational knowledge, and trust are business assets whether they appear as a line item or not. If your role involves clients, vendors, systems, money, or long-term agreements, document what you do. Keep transition materials organized. Put important warnings in writing. Send them professionally. Do not hide information to make yourself look indispensable. But do not let anyone pretend your work had no value simply because it is difficult to measure. And if you are leaving a company, know your rights and your boundaries. Follow confidentiality agreements. Do not take proprietary information. Do not interfere with contracts. But if they call after you leave and ask for your expertise, do not rush into an informal conversation that makes you responsible without giving you authority. Ask for a written agreement. Define the scope. Set a fair rate. Clarify who makes decisions. Urgency is not a reason to work without protection. Being untouchable does not mean a company cannot fire you. It means your work is ethical, documented, visible, and valuable enough that when they ignore it, the consequences speak louder than you ever needed to. The next story begins in a conference room where I thought I was walking into my firing. My manager had HR waiting, my badge had already been deactivated, and he had a speech prepared about performance concerns. But 10 minutes into the meeting, the CEO walked in holding an audit report with my manager's name on every page. The meeting that was supposed to end my career became the moment his entire scheme collapsed. Subscribe, because when he realized why I had been documenting everything, it was already too late.